So let's start, right? Good afternoon, everyone. So I'm Huda from the WHO Country Office of Maldives. I'll be the MC for the session today. First of all, I would like to thank Dr. Rajesh, our regional advisor for newborn child and adolescent health, for arranging this session for us, and also Dr. Rakesh Loda and Dr. Sushil Kabra and Dr. Nitin Dochak from AIMS New Delhi for sparing time for this session for the Maldives team. So I'll go briefly through the agenda before we start. First will be the opening remarks from the Ministry of Health. Dr. Nazla Rafiq will be saying a few words, and Dr. Rajesh Mehta will be saying a few words from the WHO CRO side. After that, there will be a presentation from Dr. Rakesh Loda on epidemiology, diagnosis, and transmission. Following that presentation, there will be a presentation from Dr. Sushil Kabra on the mild and moderate COVID-19 in children, some practical tips. And after that, there will be a presentation from Dr. Nitin Dochak on severe disease and MISC in children. After that, we will have a Q&A session, but while the presentations are ongoing, if you have any questions, please write them down in the chat box and we will attend to them after the presentations. So I will give the floor to Dr. Nazla Rafiq to say a few words from the Health Ministry, Government of Maldives. Dr. Nazla, please.
Thank you, Huda. And thank you, WHO, for organizing this session for us on short notice. And thank you from our side to all the facilitators who have given their time for this session. Um, this session is joined by pediatricians from IGMH, our main hospital, from ADK, and Treatment Hospital, which are the two private hospitals in the Malay region, as well as other health pediatricians from other health facilities in Malay and other atolls also. So we hope this session is useful for us, for our pediatricians, and I'm sure it will be useful for them. And there'll be lots of questions, I hope, in the end where we can have an interactive session. Thank you.
Thank you, Dr. Nazla. I also hope we could have an interactive session today. So I'll hand over to Dr. Rajesh.
Thank you, Huda, and thanks, Dr. Nazla from the Ministry of Health. We commend that the Ministry of Health actually requisitioned this help. We are happy to provide this assistance in going forward for getting prepared to handle pediatric COVID cases because the pandemic is still going on. And as of yesterday, as the WHO website reports, there have been more than 181 million cases reported globally, and including more than almost 400,000 having been reported to WHO globally. The sero share is also quite big within the global, number of cases. We have had more than 34.7 million cases reported until yesterday. And Maldives has reported 73,000, around 73,500 cases, including unfortunate 209 deaths so far. That's as per the reporting to WHO. And we recently saw a very big wave in India, actually a huge tsunami of new cases, which is now actually troubling Bangladesh, Nepal, and to some extent other countries as well. So Maldives has also had a wave, which I think they are in good control of. But that's a clear signal that we must keep prepared. So therefore, it is commendable that Maldives has arranged this session today. During the second wave, we saw a huge number of cases requiring hospital treatment, and the healthcare system almost collapsed in India. And Bangladesh is also facing similar situation in a couple of cities. Nepal also has similar, challenges. So therefore, we don't know going forward how many beds would be required, but we should be prepared. Our observation was that in many pediatric wards, many cases were admitted of the age group of children in India, for example. And our experts will tell us the epidemiology a little bit, whether that was because of overall increase in number of cases, or was there a disproportionate of children being affected. That data we will soon hear. But in any case, pediatric COVID disease is known, and a rare entity called multi-system inflammatory syndrome is also there. So, but fortunately for us, that is a rare condition, and we know how to manage that. So therefore, the request from Maldives was that let us have a session on severe COVID and MIS-C, the syndrome. But we thought, let us also revise a little bit on how to manage even mild moderate cases, and also try to understand when to refer when the severe disease progresses. So therefore, we thought we will arrange a brief presentation on that also. We are pleased to offer this support, and thanks to the team from All India Institute of Medical Sciences, New Delhi. Today we have Dr. Kabra, Dr. Rakesh Lodha, and Dr. Nitin. They have earlier helped us to do a series of webinars on pediatric COVID starting October of 2020. And we had done a series of webinars then, and then a couple of updates later. And most recently, the team has helped Sri Lanka in a similar session. And Sri Lanka has actually prepared now their own national guidelines on managing pediatric COVID cases with the help of the AIIMS team. So we are happy to come together here, and we look forward to a very good discussion. Thank you for this opportunity. Over to you, Huda.
Thank you, Dr. Rajesh. Let's move ahead with the presentations. So our first presentation is on epidemiology, diagnosis, and transmission by Dr. Rakesh Lodha. Dr. Rakesh, please go ahead.
Good afternoon, and thank you, Dr. Huda, for the kind introduction. I also thank Dr. Rajesh Mehta for this opportunity for the AIIMS team to interact with colleagues at Maldives. And over next an hour or so, we'll just provide an update on what we understand about the pediatric COVID. So we'll briefly cover the changing epidemiology of COVID-19 with some special reference to children. Update on the mode of transmission and diagnosis, briefly about clinical features, assessment of severity, and then we go on to the management according to severity, highlighting an update on the therapeutics. Then we'll spend some time on the new entity, MIS-C, which is an important one for children. And if time permits, or if there are queries, we may talk about vaccines later on. So, as Dr. Mehta has highlighted about the number of cases, so globally more than 181 million, India nearly 30 million, and in Maldives, from the data that we got, more than 70,000 cases, and correspondingly the number of deaths. So if you kind of look at the waveforms that are there, these are the y-axis is different, but we kind of clearly seeing at least two waves that we see in India, multiple humps that are seen for the global thing. And in Maldives, unfortunately, there's been a sharp rise recently, and that seems to be settling down a bit. Now, this particular graph from the another website or World in Data. So I think we need to normalize whatever numbers we see based on per million people. And these are the 7-day moving averages of the daily new confirmed cases. And here we can see at this time point for Maldives, it's nearly 378 new cases per million population, which is substantially higher than what currently is being seen in some of the other countries. We just took as examples like the United Kingdom and United States and India. So while the overall numbers may appear to be small, but I think it has to be looked at in context of the overall population. And this kind of just tells us about that the progress of the pandemic in different countries. In terms of when we look at what's happening to children, so thankfully, children have been less frequently affected, I would say, and less severely affected. And these are some data from India where individuals less than 20 years are approximately 36% of the population. But when we look at the distribution amongst the confirmed cases, we find that individuals less than 20 group constitute only about 12% of all confirmed cases. And of all deaths, only 3% are contributed by less than 20-year age group when we talk about the COVID-related deaths. So these kind of just tell us about that the disease frequency as well as severity may be less in children. Now, what are so we all have seen rapid surges at different time points in different countries which are coming in. And what are the likely reasons? So while there are various aspects related to the, let's say, not following the COVID appropriate behavior, mass gatherings, again, lack of containment measures, and also concerns about waning immunity after the first wave. So the people who got infected and their antibody levels decline. But again, that these are some of the points. But it seems that it's the appearance of the mutant strains or the variants of concern, which seem to be the dominant ones, which would be happening, in terms of how the pandemic progresses or how these surges happen. So this kind of just tells us about the various strains that have been from India that have been seen. So starting December, again, we can see that this is the B1.36, which had been dominant, gradually decreased. And when we saw the second wave, it was predominantly the Delta variant, which was the dominant strain, which kind of appeared rather abruptly and it spread. So these are things which one would have to figure out only by virtue of an ongoing surveillance, and these may give us insights. At the same time, there have to be measures looking at how we can implement or adhere to the COVID appropriate behaviors. Now, there have been concerns that whether children are more frequently affected during the current surge, and also concern about whether the children are going to be more severely affected, let's say, in the upcoming surges. So, as Dr. Mehta had highlighted, that overall numbers did increase, but the actual proportion of individuals below 20 years of age of all confirmed cases has consistently been 12% since last year. So it's not that they are more frequently affected. As the sheer numbers of individuals affected increase, the number of children who would be affected would also increase, but there's nothing to suggest that they are disproportionately affected. Similarly, they are less severely affected, and there could be multiple reasons in general. So even with the previous infections with SARS, like the SARS-CoV-1 and the MERS-CoV, children seem to be less susceptible as compared to the other respiratory viruses, or they may have mild asymptomatic infection. Most of the children are infected by adult family members, and at least in the initial part of the pandemic within the country, there was a policy for isolating individuals who had SARS-CoV-2 infection, and that may have reduced the exposure of children. And even in some studies done on household contacts, the odds of infection in children was significantly less than that seen in the elderly, the odds ratio being only 0.26. Then there has been a lot of research around the ACE2, which is the receptor for the SARS-CoV-2. And this is less expressed in the nasal epithelium on children. It varies and it may increase during adolescence. And that may reduce the risk of infection per se. On the other hand, when we talk about the lungs ACE2 receptor expression, that is this is protective against the lung injury. And in the elderly, there is a decline in this expression, and therefore they are more prone for severe disease. The other thing that we have to keep in mind is that in children, there is a strong innate immune response, and which is kind of repeatedly exposed to various live vaccines and also frequent viral infections, particularly respiratory infection. So therefore, this immunity, which is also known as strained immunity, could facilitate early control of infection at the site of entry, and most of the infection either remains asymptomatic or is just manifested by mild symptoms. Then in terms of once the disease happens, then the recovery is kind of enhanced by excellent regeneration capacity of pediatric alveolar epithelium, and this may just help for in better recovery. Importantly, other risk factors for severe disease which have been seen in adults, such as smoking, diabetes, obesity, are less frequent in children. So we'll quickly have an update on the mode of transmission and diagnostic modalities. So for respiratory viruses, there are three main ways. One is contact transmission by way of fomites and surfaces, and this typically happens because of droplets of infected material settling on fomites and surfaces. These being touched, and then the hands act as a conduit to the face or the nose, or to the mouth and the nose. Droplet transmission is mainly large and small respiratory droplets, and airborne transmission is mainly smaller particles less than 5 microns, which are suspended in air for a longer time and also travel to longer distances. Now, these have implications in what kind of infection control measures we take. So initial impressions last year were predominantly that it's a contact and droplet transmission, and therefore there was I would say, an excessive emphasis on surface cleaning, sanitization of the environmental surfaces, and suggesting that a simple mask may be good enough unless you are very close to the patient or are doing aerosol generating procedures such as nebulization or intubation. However, recent data seems to suggest that aerosols is the predominant transmission mode, and therefore the level of protection that we need, the respiratory protection, has to be higher than what we do for droplet transmission. So large droplet respiratory droplets, we need to clean the surfaces, physical barriers need to be created, distancing would help, and use of mask within the droplet distance and respiratory hygiene, and wearing high-grade protection such as N95 respirators or equivalent only for the so-called aerosol generating procedures. Airborne transmission, again, as we said, these particles are likely to be suspended for a longer period of time, and therefore there has to be the desirable things include negative pressure, ventilation of the facilities, air filtration, reducing crowding and time spent indoors. Masks also being used indoors because indoors the amount of ventilation is limited, and a well-fitted N95 mask. And then we need, for the healthcare workers and frontline workers, we need high-grade protection, which again would be mainly respiratory protection. So in terms of diagnostics, the mainstay of diagnosis is still based on polymerase chain reactions. We have the RT-PCR and cartridge-based nucleic acid amplification tests. Expert and the Indian test TrueNut are the examples. Then other tests which people are considering are CRISPR-mediated detection, loop-mediated isothermal amplification, which may allow a faster time to the detection. Antigen detection tests or point-of-care tests will have a little bit more discussion in the next slides. Antibody detection is not for acute disease. It just tells us about an exposure, and it would be important when we are considering possibility of multisystem inflammatory syndrome in children. So for these tests, we need a respiratory specimen. Typically, nasopharyngeal and oropharyngeal swabs are collected for the PCR test. If available, BAL or sputum can be used. There have been tests where saliva has been standardized as a respiratory specimen. So the preferred test is RT-PCR and CBNAT. Certain other tests are still undergoing validation. The antigen detection test uses a nasopharyngeal swab, which has a high specificity but low sensitivity. So it could be used as a rapid point-of-care test because your results could be available within 30 minutes. And it early in the course of disease, it would be positive. As the disease duration increases, there's a possibility that it may be false to be negative. So what is important to know that a positive test is helpful. You can diagnose the COVID-19. and do the needful in terms of isolation and management of the patient. However, a negative test does not rule out infection. So therefore, if we do a rapid antigen test, it's positive, we manage it as COVID-19. On the other hand, if it is negative, then it has to be confirmed with RT-PCR or CB-NAT test. So this has to be kept in mind that we are relying on a positive one, but if we have a negative test, we have to confirm it. Now, briefly, as happens with many other infections, there could be direct and indirect effects on children. So direct effects include acute respiratory infections, which could be a small proportion having lower respiratory tract infection. Some children manifest with GI symptoms or other systemic features. And a post-COVID syndrome, that is multisystem inflammatory syndrome in children, is going to be discussed in detail. Most of the children do not have evidence of active SARS-CoV-2 infection. And then there may be atypical manifestations, something like neurological manifestations or ophthalmological manifestations and isolation. There also have been indirect effects. There may have been downscaling of routine immunization and nutritional services. Because of the lockdown or family members being affected, family income being affected, and which would have a detrimental effect on the child's well-being and nutrition and schooling and so on. And in many places, because of the various restrictions imposed, the schools have been closed for a long time, which would seriously affect the learning. And there would be mental health issues. And also at times may have influenced the ability of the parents to go out for work once the lockdown is opened up. So with this, I'll hand over to Dr. Kabra to discuss the clinical features of COVID-19. Thank you.
So good afternoon, friends. We will be discussing about the clinical features and how to manage mild and moderate disease. So let us see the incubation period. The data for pediatric population are limited, but the median incubation period is 5 days. Though it may be extended to 14 days, similar to that of an adult patient. Some studies suggest that it may be 2 days to 10 days, but median is around 5 days. The clinical phenotype may be pre-symptomatic, the time period between exposure to the virus and development of symptoms, and the child may be infectious during pre-symptomatic period. At least it has been observed that when the child develops symptoms, even 2 days before that, child may be infectious. Another major group is asymptomatic, in which the test is positive without any clinical symptoms and signs, and chest imaging is normal if it is done. These children are identified during the contact tracing and are infectious. So this is a group which may spread the infection. The classical manifestations of COVID include fever, cough, cold, sore throat, shortness of breath. They are indistinguishable from the other respiratory viral infection, and there may be some atypical symptoms. Atypical symptoms include gastrointestinal symptoms, may be seen in 5 to 10% of the patients. It may occur without respiratory symptoms in small proportion of children, and those gastrointestinal symptoms, predominantly it would be diarrhea, vomiting, and pain abdomen. Cutaneous symptoms are seen, cutaneous manifestations are seen in less than 3%. It includes maculopapular, urticarial, and vascular eruptions and transient livedo reticularis. COVID was seen in children and young adults in form of a reddish purple nodule on distal digits, seen predominantly in children. These are the COVID toes. And then lastly, multisystem inflammatory syndrome in children, which we will be discussing in later part of the presentation. So when we have seen a classical manifestations of COVID in a child, the first thing is to differentiate, to classify whether it is a mild disease, moderate disease, and severe disease, and accordingly we institute the treatment. The mild disease is characterized by varying degree of fever, sore throat, rhinorrhea, cough, but no fast breathing. So if we see what is the treatment, this coronavirus epidemic was declared pandemic in early 2020. At that time, we were not aware about the detail of the course, complications, and treatment. Over a few months, some therapeutic agents that were likely to be effective were identified, and therapeutic agents including hydroxychloroquine, chloroquine, lopinavir, interferon, remdesivir, favipiravir, ivermectin, etc. were seen, And there were some immunomodulator drugs like tocilizumab and corticosteroids. Several multi-site controlled trials were carried out to document efficacy of these therapeutic agents, and World Health Organization provided living guidelines about the current status of various therapeutic agents in COVID. All these were carried out in subjects above 16 to 18 years of age. No pediatric studies. However, results are extrapolated to children wherever there were no biological reasons to suspect that children will behave differently. So the last therapeutic living guidelines were published on 31st March this year, and this was based on the selection of guideline developing group members that represented all WHO regions, has an equal gender balance, and includes specialists in infectious diseases, pulmonary medicine, intensive care, emergency care, primary care physicians, ethics, and 4 patient panel groups. And the conclusion of these living guidelines is WHO suggests a strong recommendation for systemic corticosteroid in patients with severe and critical COVID-19 infection. A conditional recommendation against systemic steroids in patients with non-severe COVID-19. A conditional recommendation against remdesivir in hospitalized patients with COVID-19. A strong recommendation against hydroxychloroquine in patients with COVID-19 of any severity. Not to use ivermectin in patients with COVID-19 except in the context of clinical trial, and not to use lopinavir, ritonavir in patients with COVID-19. So based on that, we'll decide about how to manage these mild, moderate, or severe disease. So let us see the mild disease. The children with influenza-like illness, not having respiratory difficulty, neither the chest syndrome, no rapid respiratory rate, and not hypoxic. That is indicated by a oxygen saturation of more than or equal to 94% in room air. And as all of us pediatricians are aware about the age-specific cutoff for labeling a child as having a fast breathing, that is, if child is less than 2 months, more than 60 breath per minute, 3 to 11 months, more than 50 breath per minute, and 12 to 60 months, more than 40 per minute, and more than 60 months, more than 30 breath per minute. Some children may have no fever or have only GI symptoms such as nausea, vomiting, as we discussed in the previous slide. Physical examination shows a congestion of pharynx and no auscultatory abnormality. Then we'll say that it is a mild disease. And there is no need for any investigation once we have made a diagnosis of COVID-19 infection. So the question comes, how to manage these patients? First and foremost is that these patients should be managed at home isolation if it is possible, and how to decide whether the child is eligible for home isolation. And so it is, first is the respiratory rate is less than age-specific cutoff. Room air oxygen saturation is equal to or more than 94%. And absence of all these, including cardiovascular, diabetes, immunocompromised state, chronic lung disease, chronic kidney disease, chronic liver disease, and cerebrovascular disease, and obesity. So now we are suggesting that even if these are present, we can discuss with the family regarding home isolation. Then the other thing is social eligibility criteria. So we have to check that the patient has a requisite facility for isolation at his or her residence, and also for quarantine the family contacts. Caregiver is available to provide care on 27 basis. If available, using a country-specific app for tracking COVID-19 positive cases. In India, it is a Arogya Setu app. The parents' caregivers have agreed to monitor health of the child and regularly inform his or her health status to the child or doctor. The parents' caregiver have filled an undertaking for the self-isolation and shall follow the home isolation guidelines strictly. And if home isolation is not feasible, as it may be a child is immunosuppressed or chronic disease, even then we can discuss with the family and decide whether to put him in a hospital or COVID care center or home isolation. But at all children at home isolation or COVID care facility, it should be in the child-friendly hospital, and parents and attendants should be allowed to take care of the child with appropriate PPE and precautions. The treatment is symptomatic in form of paracetamol, 10 to 15 milligram per kilo, may be repeated every 4 to 6 hourly. Try to avoid NSAIDs, non-steroidal anti-inflammatory drugs like ibuprofen, mefenamic acid, though there is no evidence against these use of these medications. Cough suppression doesn't have any role. Throat soothing agents like warm saline gargles in older children and adolescents, and honey to be used after after the infancy. Antibiotics are not indicated in mild COVID disease. In addition, supportive care will include balanced diet, adequate hydration with plenty of liquid intake, adequate rest, and deep breathing exercise in older children, and maintaining appropriate ambient room temperature. The monitoring by parents at home includes maintenance of the monitoring chart, which we'll be seeing next slide, counting of respiratory rate 2 to 3 times a day when child is not crying, oxygen saturation monitoring by handheld saturation probe, and looking for chest drawing, nasal flare, cold extremities, and urine output. And if these are the red flags, like if there is a fast breathing, presence of danger signs, or oxygen saturation dips below 94%, these are red flag signs, and the child should be taken to hospital, or the parents should be seeking help with the healthcare people. So what should be the monitoring? This is a simple chart which can be monitored by parents at home by pulse rate, respiratory rate, oxygen saturation, nasal flare, temperature, fluid intake, and other symptoms 3 times a day, if it is possible. And to summarize, the mild illness has a sore throat, fever, rhinorrhea, cold, but no fast breathing. Treatment is supportive, rest, adequate hydration, and feeding. Paracetamol 10 to 15 milligram per kilo per dose for fever, and report if worsening of danger signs or appearing of danger signs. So now we come to a moderate disease, which is characterized by fast breathing, as we already discussed, more than 60 breath minutes for children, for infants below 2 months of age, more than 50 per minute for 2 to 12 months of age, more than 40 for 1 to 5 years, and more than 30 for more than 5 years of age. And or oxygen saturation equal to or less than 94%, but more than 90%, and no signs of severe pneumonia or severe illness. These patients require admission in dedicated COVID facility and investigations as per requirement, not required in all. The baseline complete blood count, including ESR and blood sugar, can be done, and chest X-ray can be carried out. Treatment include oxygen supplementation in children with oxygen saturation between 90 to 93% to maintain an oxygen saturation of more than 94%. So it is to be noted that our aim is to be more than 94%, not at a 98, 99 or 100%. Inhale bronchodilator if there is a wheezing, to be given by meter dose inhaler with spacer preferred over nebulizer, because nebulizer will cause increase in aerosol generation and dissemination of infection. There is no indication for empirical antimicrobial in all. Empirical antimicrobial therapy if suspicion of bacterial infection is there, and systemic steroids not given to all, but if there is a very rapid deterioration of hypoxia, say within 6 to 12 hours of hospitalization. Children admitted without hypoxia, say more than 94%, but develops SpO2 of between 90 to 93%. And children admitted with hypoxemia and progresses to severe disease. All these patients, though it would be a small proportion, but maybe it may require steroids, in systemic steroids to these patients. So there is no evidence of benefit giving any of the following drugs to moderately affected children, hence not recommended. And these include, again, we re-emphasize, no role of chloroquine, hydroxychloroquine, doxycycline, ivermectin, no role of lopinavir, ritonavir, remdesivir, or favipiravir, no role of immunomodulators like tocilizumab, interferon, or convalescent plasma infusion. There is a need for monitoring in form of vitals. Laboratory monitoring is done only if there is a worsening of symptoms or hypoxia in form of a complete blood count, kidney and liver function test to document organ dysfunction, and inflammatory markers like C-reactive protein. But these are only if there is a worsening of symptoms and child is going towards the severe disease. And if there is an increased work of breathing, hemodynamic instability, or increase in oxygen requirement, these are the indication for referring to the higher center. So again, I emphasize that referral is not dependent on a very high value of CRP, but based on or other laboratory values. It is based on increased work of breathing, that is a clinical, hemodynamic instability, a clinical, and increase in the oxygen requirement to maintain oxygen saturation of equal to or more than 94%. So to summarize, moderate disease or pneumonia as indicated by the fast breathing, oxygen saturation less than 94, no signs of severe pneumonia or illness. These patients require admission, monitoring for progress, feeding and fluids, avoid dehydration and overhydration. Antipyretic preferred drug is paracetamol, amoxicillin if suspicion of bacterial infection. If oxygen saturation is less than 94%, start oxygen, and steroids only if there is a rapid progression. Not all patients with a moderate disease should be given steroids. So now we will discuss the severe disease, and Dr. Nitin Dochek will take you through the severe disease as well as MISC.
Thank you and good afternoon to all. So I'll be discussing about severe illness. Fortunately, children are less commonly affected and they have very infrequently severe illness. But when to classify as severe illness? So the classification is similar to severe pneumonia in WHO pneumonia classification. So any child who along with fast breathing has cyanosis or saturation less than 90%, or there are features of increased respiratory efforts like grunting, severe retraction, or there is associated lethargy, somnolence, or seizures, and also children with ARDS, shock, and multi-organ dysfunction, they are included in severe illness for COVID-19. These children should be admitted preferably in a ICU or SDU settings, especially those who are presenting with ARDS, shock, or multi-organ dysfunction. The investigations include the CBC, including ESR, blood glucose, CRP for inflammatory marker, LFT and RFT to look for any multi-organ dysfunction. And chest X-ray should be done in these children. And these children are started on steroids, which will be injection methylprednisolone 1 to 2 milligram per kg per day, or equivalent dose of dexamethasone. Empirical antimicrobials are given in most of these children, and they are to be started on oxygen therapy. We should be using restrictive fluid therapy to prevent fluid overload, and organ support may be needed, such as renal replacement therapy, as per the individual patient. Now, briefly coming to oxygen therapy, so what all modes can be used? So the saturation target are more than 94% during resuscitation and more than 90% once the child is stable. The initial oxygen can be given through a nasal prong or nasal cannula. The usual flow rates are 1 liter per minute for infants, 2 to 4 liter per minute for young children, and 4 to 6 liter per minute for older children. And one can use a surgical mask over the nasal cannula, which will prevent the aerosolization and decrease the risk of hospital transmission. If the child is not maintaining saturation on the above measure or nasal prong, but doesn't have features of severe distress like severe retractions, so the other oxygen therapies which provide higher FiO2 but do not provide any positive expiratory pressure may be used. So these include a face mask at a flow of more than 5 liter per minute, which will provide you a FiO2 of somewhere from 40 to 60%. Venturi mask can provide FiO2 from again 28 to 60%, or a non-rebreathing mask at higher flows at 10 to 15 liter per minute, which can provide FiO2 up to 90 to 100%. If the child is not maintaining or is having significant distress on the previous measures, we should upgrade the respiratory support. So that will include a heated humidified high flow nasal cannula or HFNC. which is usually preferred over CPAP or BiPAP as a upfront therapy. And the flow rates that are given in children are 0.5 to 1 liter per minute initially, and it can go up to maximum of 2 liter per kg per minute, and usually up to 60 liter per minute as a maximum flow. It is vital that you monitor the parameters like heart rate, respiratory rate, saturation, and work of breathing, so that we can identify the respiratory failure on this support early on. And if we have to further escalate the therapy, we can do that early on before they progress into multi-organ dysfunction. And again, a 3-ply mask can be used to cover the mouth and nose to prevent spread of aerosols with HFNC also. NIV can be used in children who are not maintaining on HFNC, but we should take care that we do not use an NIV with single limb or vented mask, because it will have high risk of aerosolization. Also, we connect a bacterial or viral filter at the exhalation port, and again monitor closely and intubate early if there is clinical deterioration or no improvement in 1 hour. And in severe illness, the phenotype can be of ARDS, which can be classified based on oxygenation index as we do for other illnesses. The mild ARDS you can manage with HFNC or NIV, and for older children you can give a trial of awake prone. In severe ARDS, mechanical ventilation is needed. One has to give low tidal volumes from 4 to 6 liter per minute ml per kg, and high positive expiratory pressure. And it is preferable to use cuffed endotracheal tube so that the pressures are delivered better and there is low leak. Also, that will decrease the risk of aerosolization. Fluid restrictive approach should be used, and if there is poor response, prone ventilation can be done. For children presenting with shock, the possibilities could be a septic shock, or there could be a myocardial dysfunction due to myocardial involvement. And the initial management again includes the crystalloid bolus of 10 to 20 ml per kg over 30 to 60 minutes, and it can be given fast if the patient is hypotensive. But we have to be very cautious with fluid administration because there can be associated myocardial dysfunction. So if you have suspicion of myocardial dysfunction, you can give slower bolus, you can give smaller bolus of 5 to 10 ml per kg, or we can go for early inotropic support. And it is very essential that we avoid fluid overload in these children. Now, frequently the question arises whether we should give anticoagulants routinely to these children or not. So in the retrospective studies, it has been seen that around 1.1 to 2.2% of children who were admitted with COVID-19 had developed thrombotic complication. So anticoagulation is not routinely recommended for all children with severe disease, but therapeutic anticoagulation should be done if there are some thrombotic complication. And the choice of agent is enoxaparin, which is 1 mg per kg subcutaneous twice daily, and oral anticoagulants are not recommended. Prophylactic anticoagulation can be given in selective cases, especially where there is high risk for thrombosis. And these indications include a strong personal or family history of venous thromboembolism, and an indwelling central venous catheter with 2 or more additional risk factors as described here, or 4 or more risk factors. Agent of choice is again enoxaparin, which is given in 0.5 mg per kg. This dose is lower than the therapeutic dose, subcutaneously twice daily. Among the risk factors of thrombosis include personal history of venous thromboembolic event or family history of first degree relative with venous thromboembolic event, presence of central venous catheter, decreased mobility from the baseline, any active malignancy or inflammatory disease, morbid obesity, severe dehydration, and recent surgery or trauma. So these risk factors will be important when we are considering indications for prophylactic anticoagulation. So to summarize, children should be categorized into disease severity as per signs and symptoms and should be managed according to the severity of illness. Infection prevention and control measures are very important for all suspected and confirmed cases. Mild diseases can be managed at home with appropriate monitoring and symptomatic treatment. Moderate disease should be admitted in COVID hospitals and if required, they can give low flow oxygen and symptomatic treatment. Severe disease should be admitted to COVID hospitals, preferably in HDU and pediatric ICU. Oxygen therapy can be given as per the respiratory distress. Steroids are first line of therapy in severe disease. Antimicrobials can be given if there is suspicion of bacterial infection or sepsis or septic shock. Antiviral agents, ivermectin, doxycycline, or convalescent plasma, there is no data to support their use in children. Also, there has been no survival benefit even in adults. Now we will discuss about multisystem inflammatory syndrome related to SARS coronavirus infection in children, the MISC. It was initially reported from United Kingdom in April 2020. The surge was followed by the surge of COVID-19 by almost a month, so which gave us suspicion that probably it is a post-infectious complication of COVID-19. But overall, it is uncommon and it is seen in less than 1% of all COVID-19 children and adolescents. And if we see that less than 10% of children hospitalized with COVID-19 constitute the MISC. WHO has given criteria for diagnosis of MISC, which includes like children from age group 0 to 19 years who have fever for more than equal to 3 days, have two of the following, which include rash, bilateral non-purulent conjunctivitis, or mucocutaneous inflammatory signs, or like some oral features, swelling or rash on the hand and feet, hypotension or shock, features of myocardial dysfunction, pericarditis, valvulitis, or coronary abnormalities, any evidence of coagulopathy or acute gastrointestinal symptoms. And it should be associated with elevated markers of inflammation such as elevated ESR, CRP, or procalcitonin. But because these features can be found in other systemic infections, so it is very prudent that no other obvious microbial cause of inflammation such as bacterial sepsis, staphylococcus, or streptococcal shock syndrome should be present. So these should be ruled out. And there should be epidemiological evidence of exposure to COVID-19 or presence of COVID-19, which could be RT-PCR positivity, antigen positivity, or serology positivity in the child, and or likely contact with the patient with COVID-19. There are various mimics of MISC, and it is very important that before jumping onto therapy that we rule out or we evaluate for these mimics, which can include infectious causes like bacterial sepsis, dengue shock syndrome, rickettsial infection, scrub typhus, chikungunya infection, and fever with acute abdomen. Kawasaki disease also have close resemblance to MISC. Other syndromes like toxic shock syndrome, severe COVID-19 with the inflammation can also mimic some of the features. Other severe viral infection, myocarditis, or macrophage activation syndrome, or HLH secondary to infection or other causes could be kept as one of the differential diagnoses. Pathophysiology is incompletely understood, and this condition is diagnosed in children who had been previously infected or also in those who have active infection, so which is like detection of virus in the children. Possible mechanisms are there is a immune dysregulation, there could be antibody mediated enhancement, also there are hypotheses that T cell mediated damage and enhancement of inflammation is seen in these children. So what has been seen in children with severe disease and including MISC is that the viral clearance takes a longer time. The IFN response is much higher compared to the mild disease, and it is delayed response. And other markers like IL-6 and chemokines, so cytokines are elevated to more elevated, and also they are elevated for prolonged periods. So this was one study where they tried to compare features of MISC from severe COVID. So what they found was that children with MISC were slightly older, and there were more in the non-Hispanic Black population. Also, compared to MISC, there was more cardiorespiratory involvement and more cardiovascular involvement without respiratory involvement. and more mucocutaneous signs were present without cardiovascular involvement compared to the severe COVID patients. Also, the MISC patient had higher neutrophil to lymphocyte ratio, so something like 6.4. So if it's more than 5, it's very suggestive. There are high C-reactive protein levels, and there are lower platelet counts in the MISC group. Outcomes with good supportive care are similar in both the groups. And what has been seen is that though at presentation, around 34% patients have severe left ventricular systolic dysfunction, and coronary aneurysm can be seen in 13%. But by 1 month, the majority of them, like 91% of them, achieve normal the ventricular function, and around 80% the coronary vessels are normal. To understand the clinical spectrum of MISC, so what is very important is that there is features of hyperinflammation, and the few of the patients, they might be mimicking the classic Kawasaki disease or incomplete Kawasaki disease. And the other phenotype could be hyperinflammation with myocarditis with or without shock, and other is the hyperinflammation with without myocarditis presenting with shock or multi-organ failure. So this was one study from a review of patients from United States, where they classified into 3 major phenotypes. So the class 1 phenotype, which was 35% of the patients, had hyperinflammation with multi-organ dysfunction, more than 6 organs, and the predominant organ system involved were GI and cardiovascular. These had like 98% of these patients had serology positivity. Class 2, again, around 1/3 of the patients, they had ARDS and myocarditis. Large number of them had RT-PCR positivity, so probably the ongoing infection could be there in this. And then these patients had higher mortality, up to 5%. Class 3 were the patients who were younger patient who had features typical of Kawasaki disease or atypical Kawasaki disease, did not have mortality in this group, and a large number, 63%, had serology positivity in this age group. So this is a protocol for evaluation of MISC. So any child during this period with unremitting fever more than 38 degrees, epidemiological link to SARS coronavirus 2, and if the clinical features are present. If these clinical features are not present, then you evaluate for alternate diagnosis and monitor for features of MISC, because some of the features might come up later. If these are present, you have to look for any shock or life-threatening manifestation. If these are not present, you can take a tiered approach. So initially you do a screening test. If tier 1 test, if these are positive, then you go for tier 2 test and also work for tropical infections. If the shock or life-threatening manifestation are present, then we do not have time. So we go for simultaneous tier 1 and tier 2 test. If these tests suggest or fulfill the diagnostic criteria of MISC, again, these are present, then you have to see for any life-threatening complications like cardiac dysfunction, coronary involvement, multi-organ dysfunction, or other life-threatening conditions. If these are present, then you have to start therapy while completing evaluation of tropical infection. If any urgent features are not present, then you rule out the other tropical infection and you can start therapy after that. So the tier 1 tests, they include complete blood count, metabolic profile that includes LFT, KFT, blood gas, and blood sugar, inflammatory marker in form of CRP and or ESR, and SARS coronavirus 2 serology and or RT-PCR and blood culture. A positive screen if both of these are present. So features of inflammation in form of CRP more than 5 milligram per liter and or ESR more than 40 millimeter per hour. And at least one of these should be present. So absolute lymphocyte count should be less than 1,000, platelet count less than 1,50,000, sodium less than 135 milligram per liter, neutrophilia or hypoalbuminemia. If the screen is positive, you go for tier 2 test, which include evaluation of cardiac system by ECG, echocardiogram, also evaluate for coronaries,
and features investigation like BNP and troponin I and troponin T. Inflammatory markers should be done as many as feasible and possible, included procalcitonin, ferritin, PT, APTT, D-dimer, fibrinogen, LDS, triglyceride, and cytokine panel, whatever is available. A blood smear should be done, and SARS coronavirus 2 serology, if it is already not done, should be done now. Also, like common tropical infection, which are prevalent in the local in the region, which usually includes malaria, dengue, enteric fever, rickettsial illness like scrub typhus, should also be evaluated. Now coming to treatment of MISC, what is very clear is that it is predominantly a hyperinflammatory syndrome. So the therapies include the immune modulation and immune suppression. And if we can have approach it as per the acuity of the illness. So in children who have MISC with shock or other life-threatening condition, then we have to start the therapy upfront, which includes methylprednisolone 2 mg per kg per day, along with IVIG, which is 2 gram per kg over 12 to 18 hours, which can be given over 48 hours if there is a significant myocardial dysfunction and there is chances of fluid overload. And antimicrobial should be started in these patients. Also, simultaneously should evaluate for tropical infection in these patients. On the other hand, if there are no life-threatening conditions, then you can do a stepwise approach and you can initially rule out the tropical infections, and steroids, methylprednisolone 1 to 2 mg per kg per day can be used as a first-line therapy in this subgroup. IVIG can be used as an alternative therapy or a first-line therapy as per availability and feasibility. Many a times patients can have features which are mimicking Kawasaki disease and fulfilling most of the criteria for Kawasaki disease. The therapy is not very clear in these patients, but preferred approach will be a combination of steroids, methylprednisolone 1 to 2 mg per kg per day, along with IVIG 2 gram per kg over 12 to 18 hours, and also simultaneously evaluation for tropical infection. Anticoagulation and antiplatelet drugs. So aspirin in dose of 3 to 5 mg per kg per day up to 75 mg per day should be given in all children with MISC. They should be avoided if there is thrombocytopenia with platelet count less than 80,000 or there is any active bleeding, and it should be continued until there is normalization of coronary vessels or for at least 4 to 6 weeks. Anticoagulation with enoxaparin should be done in dose of 1 mg per kg if there is established large coronary aneurysms with Z score of more than 10, if there is established thrombosis, or there is severe left ventricular dysfunction with ejection fraction less than 35%. Even after initial immunomodulation, if the patient is not responding in form, there is a unremitting fever, or there are new complications beyond 48 hours of treatment, then rescue therapies can be a repeat dose of IVIG, high dose steroids with methylprednisolone pulse 10 mg per kg per day for 3 to 5 days. If still unresponsive to others, one has to consult experts for use of biologics, which could be infliximab or tocilizumab, and also simultaneously should assess for other etiologies for the similar symptom complex. For patients, for cardiac evaluation, ECG should be repeated 48 hourly initially. Echo should be repeated at 7 to 14 days and then again at 4 to 6 weeks. If the echo was abnormal initially, a repeat echo should be done at 1 year. Other optional investigations include cardiac MRI if there was ejection fraction was less than 50%, or cardiac CT if we are still suspecting distal coronary artery aneurysm. So coming to Indian experience of MISC, there are multiple case reports and case series. Mostly they describe the clinical features and outcomes. Atypical presentation have also been described, which could be uveitis, status epilepticus, encephalopathy, neuropathy, or gastrointestinal bleeds. This is a summary of various reports from India, mostly range with patient of from 20 to 30. And if you see the GI symptoms, cardiac symptoms, coronary vessels, they are the most frequent symptoms. So if we see in this study, the GI symptoms and cardiac symptoms are seen in almost 90% of the patients. Other series have described atypical features like acute encephalitis-like illness. Some of them can mimic Kawasaki illness or toxic shock syndrome. And again, in other studies, the rash and non-purulent conjunctivitis can also be seen in around 1/3 of the patients. These are other studies which, again, they have similar presentation with GI involvement, respiratory involvement, rash, conjunctivitis, and multi-organ dysfunction. Therapies, again, they vary from study to study, but the most commonly used therapies include methylprednisolone, ranging from 1 to 2 milligram to pulse doses, and IVIG. So, and some of the series have also described tocilizumab and other immunomodulators. So, to summarize, we are seeing a rapid COVID surge, though more number of children are being affected because of large number overall, but severity of illness doesn't seem to have changed. Confirmatory tests are RT-PCR, CBNet, and rapid antigen test on respiratory specimen. The disease severity should be based on the clinical features, and management is mainly supportive. So children can be managed at home if they are asymptomatic or only mildly symptomatic. Moderate and severe illness needs inpatient admitted in the hospital and inpatient care, and rational use of medication including steroids is required. MISC is recognized, and it's an inflammatory condition which is related to COVID-19. It is very important to keep a suspicion of MISC in children with fever and multi-organ dysfunction, but we should also be very careful for mimics of MISC, including a tropical infection. Thank you.
Thank you very much, Dr. Rakesh, Dr. Sushil, and Dr. Nitin for the very informative and interesting presentations. So we will move ahead for the question and answer sessions. Participants are requested to raise your hands if you have questions. While the participants raise their hands, I will just go through the questions, some questions in the chat box. So there's one question from Dr. Hawa Ashfa, which the first question is, in moderate disease, apart from steroids, should we consider adding remdesivir in rapid deterioration? And our follow-up question is remdesivir not recommended in severe or in critical COVID-19?
As we have discussed, though we did not go in the details of analysis, but a living guideline issued by WHO suggests that there is no role of remdesivir in any severity of illness caused by COVID-19. And that's why it is not recommended and taken off from the list of medications to be used for COVID-19. So no role of remdesivir in any severity.
Thank you. The next question is...
just a second.
Yeah.
So Sushil and Rakesh, so are there further trials happening which will inform these guidelines? For the moment, I think in research, remdesivir could be used, but not for routine purposes. Do we expect any further guidance soon?
It was discussed, and as of now, there is no sufficient evidence to do a re-analysis of already published guidelines.
Right. So the recommendations are quite clear. We do not use remdesivir in moderate disease in children, right?
Yes, sir. Yeah.
Okay. Great.
Thank you, Dr. Rajesh. So the next question is, what would be the preferred inotrope for fluid-resistant shock at first and second line in MISC?
So it will again depend upon the first line therapy. In most of the cases is epinephrine, but if you have a very high suspicion of myocardial dysfunction, and if there are features suggestive of some conduction defect or myocarditis, you can use it like use other agents which are less arrhythmogenic. So something like milrinone can be tried if there is normal blood pressure, or if there is a hypotension associated, you can use a combination of noradrenaline with milrinone. So it has to be individualized, and like certainly we should be very careful about the arrhythmogenic potential of some of these drugs. So maybe a milrinone with or without noradrenaline could be used as a first line agent.
Thank you. Dr. Faisal, do you have any follow-up questions? Because that was a question you had posted in the chat box. Okay. If not, we can move to the next question. In MISC, evidence of inflammation in diagnostic criteria among the markers, is there a minimum number of markers to be elevated?
So there is like, if there is any feature, so either any one of, if it is elevated, it is taken as abnormal and a marker of inflammation. So the commonly used and commonly available are the ESR, CRP, and procalcitonin, which are can be used. And so there is nothing like all of these has to be done, but at least these three should be done in all patients wherever possible.
Thank you. There is a few more questions from Dr. Hawa Ashfa. So the other question is, in MISC, if echo normal with raised cardiac enzymes, what is the duration of aspirin? I mean, if I understand the question correctly. If not, Dr. Ashfa can please.
So I think in general, Nitin, would you like to just say?
It was again discussed in the presentation also. So there could be features of like cardiac enzymes could be elevated without cardiac dysfunction also, and or coronary anomalies. So there would be a cellular myocardial injury in some of these patients. The typical duration which is used is 4 to 6 weeks for this such patients, unless in follow-up you find that there is new development of some coronary abnormality, and then it can change according to that. So otherwise, 4 to 6 would be optimal therapy.
Thank you. I don't see any raised hand, so I will proceed with the questions in the chat box. So there's one question from Dr. Mohammed Arid, which says, how long should be methylprednisolone be given?
So again, the methyl, it can be titrated as per the clinical response. So the initial therapy of 2 mg per kg, it can be given for around 5 to 7 days. Especially if there is clinical response, then you can taper it over next 2 weeks. And so that is the usual therapy. So somewhere around 2 to 3 weeks of a total therapy is needed.
The next question is there any role of albumin infusion for significant hypoalbuminemia?
So again, because these children are at risk of, they have frequently have myocardial dysfunction and are at risk of fluid overload. So it will not routinely recommended as long as there are not features of other features like significant fluid overload or there is significant edema is there. So it is to be avoided in most of the cases as far as possible.
So while hypoalbuminemia may be a feature for which may be there in MISC or any severe disease, we don't need to routinely try and replace that. I think that's the bottom line. There may be some occasional situations where one may consider, but as a general recommendation, we are not going to correct every hypoalbuminemia with albumin infusion.
Thank you. I hope it is clarified now. So the other question is, if IVIG and methylpred are both available, is methylpred preferred over IVIG in MISC at first line?
Okay, so again, there are these three types of, you could have various phenotypes that are there, and Nitin highlighted that. So as of now, the whatever guidelines are, they are mainly based on expert recommendations. And a lot of what these recommendations have been are influenced by how Kawasaki disease is treated, because people feel that there are a lot of similarities between MISC and Kawasaki disease, and therefore people are preferring IVIG in settings where a child presents with shock or has features which are suggestive of Kawasaki disease. In the other category where the child doesn't have shock or any life-threatening manifestation and no coronary abnormalities, no features of Kawasaki disease phenotype In that setting, we would suggest using methylprednisolone first, and only if there's no response, consider IVIG. We need trials to really have a head-on comparison between IVIG and steroids. Recently, 2 studies have been published in the NEJM. One multi-country study which has been which is called the BATS study, Best Available Treatment Strategy, and that they have looked at multi-country observational data. So overall, and another one was done in the United States in the last year, again observational data. And what it appears is that the messages which seem to be clear are that if IVIG is used, then the results are better with the combination of IVIG and steroids, typically methylprednisolone. On other aspects, the data are still not very clear-cut. There may be some indicators that steroids alone may be better than IVIG alone. So while more data are emerged, I guess the current guidelines do seem to suggest use of IVIG, at least in children who have life-threatening manifestations or Kawasaki disease phenotype.
Thank you. I think that answers some of the other questions also in the chat box. So on, there's one question which says that, is there any significant advantage of adding IV methylprednisolone to IVIG and aspirin in Kawasaki disease like MISC? As first line RX for KD would be IVIG and aspirin.
So IVIG certainly, I think that's again based on what experience with Kawasaki disease is. We in the studies we still do not have a subgroup analysis for Kawasaki disease phenotype. So what is currently suggested is still a combination of IVIG and methylprednisolone in doses of 1 to 2 milligram per kg, and aspirin in 3 to 5 milligram per kg, and not as a high dose anti-inflammatory. Aspirin is what is still recommended. So you would still go ahead with the IVIG and aspirin in the antithrombotic doses.
Thank you. I hope that clears up the question. The last question, so there's one more. So if a child with acute COVID has consolidated in X-ray but not having other criteria for admission, how to proceed in those conditions?
So it would be something similar to that of giving treatment for pneumonia. And if a child is having a consolidation on X-ray, it means there must be some tachypnea suggesting that it is a pneumonia, and we give antimicrobial and other supportive care. And the child should be in hospital if there is a large consolidation with tachypnea. There may or may not be hypoxia in room air.
Thank you. There's a follow-up question for the question I asked just now regarding the IVIG and aspirin. So the follow-up question is, what if there is a coronary aneurysm regarding the high dose of aspirin? So follow-up question regarding the high dose of aspirin. What if there is a coronary aneurysm?
So even if there is a coronary dilatation or aneurysm, then you would still continue. Initial therapy still would be IVIG, and the aspirin would need to be continued. Now, if you have very well-defined aneurysm or the measurements of coronary arteries in terms of looking at the Z-score is more than 10, in that setting, you would prefer giving enoxaparin instead of aspirin. You give it for some period of time, and after some time, you would be switching over to long-term low-dose aspirin only.
Thank you. I hope that clears up Dr. Santosh's question. You are also encouraged to unmute yourself and ask questions. So if anybody is...
Meanwhile, Huda, I have a question from local experts, like in ADK or in IGMH. How many miss cases have they seen by now? If NIAF or and Faisal or Nyasha could tell us what is the local experience of miss cases in childhood.
So may I ask Dr. Ashfa to give an explanation for that from IGMH side?
Yes, Nyasha. Thank you.
Ashfa, please.
Yeah, we actually have about 6 cases so far, And out of the 6 cases, we got the 5 cases within a week. And all of them were quite young age group. So ranging from 3 to 6 years of age. And everybody had exposure to COVID disease. And out of them, I think, 4 of them all of them had serology positive. And symptoms mainly involved were GI. They presented with vomiting, loose stools, and a bit of fever, which was there for everybody. Other systems involved majority, I think 4 of them had cardiac enzyme raised, and 2 of them, out of the 5, 2 of them, one had some coronary ectasia, and another one has some diastolic dysfunction of the heart, even though the ejection fraction or function was normal.
Okay.
Then other thing was a typical, I think 2 or 3 of them completed the complete Kawasaki criteria. And we gave IVIG and metapred for all 5 of them, and all has responded within 48 hours. And so luckily we are able to discharge 2 of them just yesterday. So currently we have about 3 cases in hospital.
Okay, so no particular challenge of dilemma whether they are fitting into criteria or not, because sometimes clinicians have to take a difficult call. Although it remains a rare disease, but possibility of overdiagnosis remains, which brings in more harm than good to the children. So one has to be careful. I hope you had no difficulties.
Yeah, one case we had who has acute COVID with RT-PCR, patient positive, but this patient had complete Kawasaki criteria. So we were thinking whether this is really acute COVID presenting with some skin manifestations, or whether this could be a child who was actually previously exposed with persistent PCR positive and coming with a sign of MISE. So we were a bit in confusion in that case.
It happens. So Rakesh, any thoughts on this case?
Excuse me. Yeah, so I think a certain proportion of kids do show RT-PCR positivity.
Okay.
It is maybe there could be, let's say, towards the fag end of active infection that they may manifest.
That okay.
So that would be a bit difficult to figure out whether there's viable virus or not. But in terms of the guidance regarding treatment guidelines, it remains the same. Only difference may be that somebody who's showing you a PCR positivity, you're going to manage in a separate COVID specific area. On the other hand, the other children who just have serology positive and do not have a PCR or CB0 positivity can be managed in the usual pediatric service or pediatric ICU. So that's what the difference would be, the approach to
isolation.
Yeah, okay. Isolation and treatment. Other than that, the other things remain the same.
Right. So in any case,
yes, Dr. Rajesh, from ADK side, our experience and documentation is by Dr. Santosh. I think he's also ready to give us this update.
Thank you, Dr. Nia. Good afternoon, everybody. I am Dr. Santosh, consultant pediatrician in ADK Hospital. Till now, we had 3 cases of MISC. We admitted 2 of them. We referred 1 to IGMS because of unavailability of bed. Both 2 cases admitted were less 1 year age, exactly 1 year age, and they had COVID positive PCR around 2 to 3 weeks back. They were only showing features of coronary aneurysm. Both were showing a coronary aneurysm without shock. So we gave IVIG and aspirin, and they were fine after a few days, and we discharged both of them. So we are following them up. They are doing well till now. Another case we saw in our ER was 6-year-old girl, which we referred to IGMH. These are the 3 cases we have seen.
Right. So IVIG is available easily. There is no problem of stocking.
Yes, it's available.
Okay, great. So
Dr. Rajesh, actually it is available right now, but myself and Faisal, we are worried that if we keep getting these kind of cases, we may run out. In fact, Faisal has sent out a SOS to the suppliers regarding possibility of procuring more IVIG.
Right. So this looks like a life-saving, drug in some cases. So if you can be in touch with Huda also, maybe there will be an option of getting it from India, because India now consumption is quite in control. So Rakesh, are we running any shortages of IVIG now?
Sir, I think IVIG is available, but I guess the number of cases of MISC have been on a rise, and we are likely to see this continuing for at least another 4 to 8 weeks because of the lag period that may be there. So while it's available, but I think certain centers may find it a little bit difficult. What we have seen is typically the children are older. Unlike Kawasaki disease, which is typically less than 5 years, here the average age may be about 10 years. And therefore, the dose that we need in terms of 2 grams per kg may come up to about average of 60 grams. So that's a challenge. So I think people are working on it. Various government agencies and all are working towards it. And I think what is important for us is to make sure that the diagnosis part is reasonably certain. Though there are challenges, many a times when the child first presents to the ER, it may not be, very accurately, we may not be able to exclude bacterial sepsis, for example. So there would be some component of overtreatment, but I think we need to live with it and have adequate supplies.
Right. So let us be and Treetop is another hospital, Rakesh.
Hello.
In Maldives.
Yes, sir.
The private sector hospital. So I think I have 2 cases. Alessandra can come in and report. Anyone from Treetop?
Dr. Alessandra Martino, please share your experience. You have written in the chat box that you have 2 cases admitted. Oh, CMCA does not have a mic.
Okay. Yeah. So I hope she can consult both ADK and IGMH consultants.
Sorry, Dr. Rajesh.
I think Dr. Amit is there. Yeah, Amit is there.
Dr. Amit can speak for Treetop Hospital. Dr. Amit, please go ahead.
So Amit also is saying mild and 1 in shock. So I think they know how to manage. Any specific time frame for IVIG, Rakesh?
So again, I think the earlier we use once we diagnose or strongly suspect, I think we should use it at that time point because of the concern regarding a child who may either progress to shock and that could be life-threatening. And again, if there is a Kawasaki type of phenotype, there would be a possibility of having coronary involvement. So earlier the better. I think that's what it would be about. Once in a while, if you kind of have a child who's admitted with fever, we didn't initially consider the possibility, and you have watched over a period of time. I think it's also important that while we have done this, we have had a few cases where till the time point we reasonably excluded or had a confirmation of serology, children improve. So there would be a subset which would improve on their own also. Otherwise, if let's say even after admission, one makes a diagnosis 3-4 days down the line, I think it still would be okay to go ahead and treat them if they are continuing to have the symptomatology.
Okay. So Saeed is also asking if IVIG is not available. Is methylprednisolone a good substitute?
So, like as already discussed, so there is no head-to-head data on IVIG and steroids, and like we presented in our presentation also, and the recent retrospective studies that are published also do not show much of a difference. So, and this IVIG, it has been a derived recommendation from the experience in Kawasaki disease. And though there are some similarity between MISC and these are not the identical diseases or same diseases. And so as of now, this methylprednisolone, if there is no life-threatening condition, should be used in a dose of 1 to 2 mg per kg for the children. And it has been described that the outcomes are not different in the groups with IVIG or steroids. So one shouldn't worry whether IVIG is available or not. I don't think any of the therapies is inferior or superior to one as of now.
While I think the question raised
Okay.
is valid because I guess there are certain teams or, clinically, again, this is more about experience of people. So they have used a higher dose of methylprednisolone of maybe 10 to 30 milligram per kg when in a child who comes with shock, for example, and IVIG is not available. So that's a dose which some people have used, but again, it's not really backed by evidence, clear-cutly that they are equivalent.
Sure. Before we leave, Rakesh.
Sir, may I ask one more question regarding that?
Yes, Niyasha. Go ahead, Niyasha.
Yeah, actually, since IGM is being a referral hospital, we are getting some cases little bit late, like let's say 9 days, 10th day of illness. So what is there any need for giving IVIG even if they come late?
So again, we would say that it would depend on the presentation. If it's predominantly fever and there are no manifestations of, cardiac involvement, no hemodynamic compromise, no, let's say, rashes or typical Kawasaki type of phenotype, in that setting, you would still work with steroids, and that should work in most of these children. On the other hand, if they have features which are suggestive of shock, significant myocardial dysfunction, then at this time point, I think most people would be comfortable with using IVIG with steroids rather than using steroids alone.
Even after 10 days, that's the question.
Yeah, so the question, that's what I'm saying. The probability of having shock and so on day 10 and all is, I think it's very low. Most of the time, these just would be prolonged fevers is what we are going to see. And in this setting, it would be fine to go ahead and only
Right. So let's adopt a very practical and clinically, specific approach based by the evidence which we discussed just now. So I have two requests, Huda. I have seen a conversation going on, pooling the experience from 3 hospitals and publication. There is a WHO, database where they have prepared case recording formats for pediatric disease, for maternal disease. So I would encourage all your referral hospitals to actually download those formats so that they keep records of all the patients in those standard formats, and then it is easy to pool them to prepare a series for publication. And if you need guidance on that, I would request Rakesh and team to be available to provide that support also. So that is one. If you start using the CRFs, the standard case recording formats, please download on the web from the WHO website, or I will send you the updated ones, and then you can start using that in your clinical records. That will be good. You can also join the global database online and submit the retrospective data as well as the prospective case data if you want to. And then you can analyze on that database your own country specific analysis, which is automated through that database. And it is de-identified data. No other country is able to see what Maldives hospitals are putting in to that global database. So that also is a possibility. We can further talk on that. My third offer is that if you want to set up a linkage with AIIMS team, they already do teleconsultation and telesupport to consultants in difficult cases, ICU type of cases, where if your hospitals need any consultation when they are stuck, I think Rakesh and your team should be available to offer case-to-case, guidance also. So, yeah, and then last, Huda, if Maldives wants to prepare the clinical guidelines for pediatric COVID, they should draft something. And again, we can help through AIIMS team to help you. We can share the samples from India, and you can modify and adapt and use, and we can help you finalize also. So requests are that you can use the WHO database and case recording format. Number 2, in difficult case scenarios, if you want to consult. Number 3, if you want to prepare national guidelines, we will be able to assist Huda. We collect those requests if required, and we are happy to help. Over.
Thank you, Dr. Rajesh. Dr. Niyasha has raised her hand, so before responding to Dr. Rajesh, I'll give the floor to Dr. Niyasha. Dr. Niyasha, please go ahead.
Oh, sorry. Thank you, Huda. Yeah, I just wanted to tell that we already have pediatric guideline made by our Maldivian doctors, Dr. Ashfa and Dr. Minna worked very hard for it, and now they are doing the second version of it. I think hopefully in a few days it will come. But yes, of course, we will always need help from WHO and AIMS team too. And another thing I wanted to ask was not related to MISC, but related to COVID. We have seen a sudden increase of Edwards syndrome in the last few weeks, especially last 1 month. Is there any, I think it's too early to ask this question, but is there any relation to any birth anomalies to COVID?
You have seen Edward syndrome?
We have seen 4 cases in the last few weeks.
Cluster, okay. Sushil, any
So it is more of a chromosomal abnormality. So it is less likely to be related. It may be just incidental.
So it may be a chance clustering, but you must investigate for the genetics part of this, and our genetic center in AIMS can help you in doing that. So Dr. Madhulika Kabra and team are available. You know them from your birth defects work. So this is a good observation, Niyasha. Clustering should always be investigated for any genetic or environmental issues. But Sushil is right. We haven't yet seen any teratogenesis. Globally, we don't find any reports. And also there is no transplacental transmission. Not too many cases have been reported so far. Yeah, Niyasha.
Okay, thank you, sir.
Thank you, Dr. Rajesh. Actually, the 3 suggestions that you have given, I think it's really good suggestions for Maldives, and I will also work with the team here locally to proceed with these suggestions. Before we end, actually, there is one question from Dr. Nazla Mustafa and has been reiterated by Dr. Niyaf as well. So I thought I'll just post that question here before we proceed. So the question is it, I'm sorry, what is the most likely incident of MIS-C post-COVID? Is it different for different variants? So is Delta variant having more high risk for MISC? So that's the question.
So I think of all COVID cases, if you look at the overall chances of MIS-C would be less than 1%. And as of now, we do not have data to link it with the type of variants that may be there. What we briefly understand is that the current Delta variant, there's some recently a paper from, I think, Singapore, where they compared the disease severity. So while everybody, I think there's a general consensus that this particular variant has higher transmissibility, but there's also some suggestion that it may have caused more severe disease in adults, more requirement for ICU and so on. But whether it is associated with more MIS-C, that is not yet answered. And this particular question may be a little bit tricky also to answer, because most of these children would not have active infection when they come in with MIS-C. But I think this is a very interesting question that's been put up.
But it remains very rare overall.
Yes, sir, it would be rare overall, and that's what it looks like. So again, what we need to understand is that in children, a larger proportion of all infections that happen in this age group are going to be asymptomatic. We are going to have only a few confirmed cases. So any calculations in terms of proportions of confirmed cases and all may not actually give us a correct picture. When there's a big wave, we would have a few children who, and that typically, that number, as I mentioned, was about 12% of all confirmed cases may be there. But when we looking at the overall seropositivity rates in various age groups in sero surveys done at different time points, children seem to be having same seropositivity rates as adults. So most of the children whom we have diagnosed MISC, they don't come up with a well-defined episode of COVID, right? So they didn't have acute COVID diagnosis. Only by serology that we are confirming that they had an exposure to the infection. So this question may be, only difference may be that if you have really good surveillance data and we are able to very carefully say that, okay, in a particular time frame, let's say Delta variant was the most dominant variant, whether the incidence of MISC or number of cases of MISC were more after that. So while we get the numerator, getting the numerator is easy. Getting the denominator of all infected, that's still going to be challenging. But I think it's a very, very, good question and something that I think we need to think how this can be answered.
Right. So unresolved. Okay.
Thank you. Thank you very much. I think we have come to the end of the session. Thank you for the very interactive session. So I hope most of your questions have been answered. And the suggestions that were given by Dr. Rajesh Mehta just now, we will work with the Maldives team to move ahead with those suggestions. First of all, before closing, I would like to thank Dr. Rakesh and your team for sparing your time to answer all our questions and also for the very interesting and informative presentations. Before we close, I would like to give the floor to Dr. Niyasha, who is a senior consultant in PEDS and also represents the Clinical Management Advisory Team for COVID, to say a few words to close the session. Dr. Niyasha.
Thank you, Huda. Let me thank first Ministry of Health, especially Taslima, for initiating this. And I also like to thank WHO Maldives. Huda, you are very good in asking questions. And Sierra, thank you, Dr. Rajesh. And the AIMS team, of course, they are always very helpful. And whenever we need help, they are always there. Thank you, Professor Sushil Kabra, Professor Rakesh Lodha, and Dr. Nitin. And of course, I want to thank all the participants from all the hospitals who are here at present. I even invited some of our nurses also. I don't know whether they are here. And thank you very much. It was a very, very nice and interesting discussion. Thank you.
Thank you. With that, we will close the session. Thank you so much, Dr. Rajesh and Dr. Rakesh, Dr. Sushil, and Dr. Nitin.
Thank you, everybody.
Have a nice day.
Good session. Thank you.